Well, let's get going on this sixth and final session of a study entitled A Biblical View of Marriage. I've been attempting to build for you a biblical mindset, a biblical way of thinking about marriage. Let me remind you at the beginning how we began, because we're going to be looking at some of the very same things towards the end of the study, here at the end of this study. We talked initially about the fact that marriage suffers from a number of difficulties in our day and age in view of the way we naturally think about marriage, especially having to do with expectations. For unless we have a proper view of marriage, we will have improper expectations. And if our expectations are improper, they're not very likely to be met. And if they're not met, we will be disappointed. And it's sad to say that many people would use the word disappointed to describe at least some of their impression of marriage. It turns out that for many people, at least on some level of experience, marriage is, in real life, a pretty disappointing thing. And tonight's study, which is intended to summarize and review what we've looked at, as well as say a few new things, is entitled Best Friends. And I think perhaps that when I use that phrase, I would be touching for some people on the very point at which the disappointment of marriage is most painful. For it's a fairly nearly universal initial expectation of young people getting married, that they have been, that they are, and that they always will be best friends. But I think that if people were very, very honest with themselves, a lot of married people, perhaps I should say most married people, would not describe their spouse as their very best friend in the years that follow. So we're talking in illustrative terms about the whole idea of being or not being each other's best friend, since we've talked all along about how our expectations drive us towards disappointment or steer us away from disappointment if our expectations are proper. The idea that our spouse will be our best friend is a pretty universal idea. I'm inclined to say perhaps especially for women. I'm not sure that most men are motivated to marry a friend. But I think that many are, and many women are, thinking that their husband will be, as he has been, their very best friend, and this is what they're looking for in marriage. But it was not a woman that wrote that quotation that I started this course with. It was a man who wrote, "Nothing is more inspirational than the uniting of two unique and divergent personalities in a marital commitment that will last for a lifetime with God's help." Remember this quotation? He said, "Who can comprehend this mysterious bonding that enables a man and woman to withstand the many storms of life and remain best friends to the end of their lives together?" I took exception to that remark because of the high view of marriage that it gave, too high a view, and to the fact that this person is putting down to a mysterious bonding the ability that a man and a woman would have to go through difficulty and emerge as best friends. What I'd like to say tonight is that there's nothing very mysterious about maintaining and building a friendship in marriage. It has much more to do with understanding of how marriage works and an understanding of each other and hard work and good manners and some of the other ingredients in any sort of friendship. But then besides that, a friendship between a husband and a wife can be an unlikely thing just because one is a man and the other is a woman. I think I also started the course with a Kathy cartoon, and I have another one here to illustrate again the fact that it is at least a challenge for a man and a woman to be best friends since they live such different lives, since they are such different people. And the cartoon strip Kathy is almost more about that than anything else. In this particular daily cartoon, we're given a picture of what it's like for a woman to buy a white shirt and what it's like for a man to buy a white shirt. Illustration of the fact that we live very different lives. When Kathy goes to buy a white shirt, the lady at the sales counter asks her these questions. Baggy, really baggy, sort of baggy, or fitted? Sheer, semi-sheer, or non-sheer? High stand-up collar, low stand-up collar, button-down collar, tuxedo collar. No collar, scoop neck, bow neck, V-neck, or plunging neck. The bottom, straight bottom, or curved bottom. Cotton, rayon, silk, wash silk, linen, light linen, heavy linen, medium linen, wrinkly linen, linen rayon blend, rayon silk blend, rayon linen cotton silk blend, normal sleeve, raglan sleeve. These are the options for a woman buying a white shirt. And when the man goes to buy a white shirt, the man behind the counter says, "Here." Well, buying a white shirt is one illustration of the many ways in which a woman's life is very different from a man's life. And a man being different than a woman and a woman being different than a man makes the possibility of them being truly best friends at least a little bit unlikely. And yet being different from one another doesn't necessarily mean that you can't be best friends. And I think of a good long friendship that lasted between C.S. Lewis and a man named Owen Barfield. And Lewis described Barfield this way: "The man who disagrees with you about everything. He's not so much the alter ego as the anti-self. Of course he shares your interests, otherwise he would not become your friend at all. but he's approached them all at a different angle. He's read all the right books, but has got the wrong thing out of every one. It's as if he spoke your language but mispronounced it. How can he be so nearly right and yet invariably just not right? Now, Lewis is talking about this friend. He calls his second friend, his second sort of friend. But in describing this person who is his friend, just because he is so different, he says, he is as fascinating and infuriating as a woman. When you set out to correct his heresies, you find that he, forsooth, has decided to correct yours. And then you go at it, hammer and tongs, far into the night, night after night, or walking through fine country that neither gives a glance to, each learning the weight of the other's punches, and often more like mutually respectful enemies than friends. Actually, though it never seems so at the time, you modify one another's thoughts. Out of this perpetual dogfight, a community of mind and a deep affection emerge. And then he says of Owen Barfield, but I think he changed me a good deal more than I changed him. Well, it is possible to be very good friends with someone who's very different from you. So even if you find yourself married to someone very different from you, it does not mean that you could not be good friends. But there are a number of strikes against you having to do with the differences between men and women, a number of other aspects of marriage, and I'd like to show you 7 reasons why you might not ever be best friends, though if you overcome these reasons, you could become each other's best friends. And I don't at all despise the sentiment of the man I quoted who talked about a couple emerging from years of difficulty, hardship, and challenge as best friends. I just think it's not a matter of mysterious bonding, but rather of understanding and hard work. So let me give you 7 reasons why you might never become best friends, 7 enemies to your marriage. In the first place, and you can take notes here, the first place we have too little regard for the needs that we bring into a marriage. And I've covered this before. This is meant to be a review as well as some new material as well. The needs in a marriage are simple. A man needs primarily respect, and a woman needs love. And the woman's ability to give respect to the man to meet that need, like the man's ability to give love to the woman to meet that need, are the twin fuels that a marriage runs on, if a marriage is going to run on at all. I talked about marriage being a spiral, and it can be a spiral onward, a spiral upward if both are meeting the other's needs. It will be a spiral downward if both are depriving one another of needs. If a woman is not able to show respect for her husband, if a husband is not able to show respect or love for his wife, then the marriage will falter. And certainly, a person who is depriving you of this most basic need, respect or love, respectively, will not be seen to you as a friend, as an ally. It can ruin a friendship if the needs are ignored. And I say again by way of review that it's most important that you go about meeting the need of your spouse with the right motive. And the right motive is simply that you do it because it is right, because it is obedience to God. So when Peter the Apostle continues to call women who are married to non-Christian or disobedient husbands to submit to them, he says in verse 6, that he says to women they should see themselves following Sarah's example and so become her daughters. Daughters of Sarah would mean women who submit to their husbands the way Sarah submitted to Abraham, and describes the whole idea of submitting as doing what is right. You don't do it because it works, though it should work. You do it because it's right. And similarly, all of us are called to submit on every level to those that we're called to submit to for that motive. Peter says in 1 Peter 2:13, submit yourselves for the Lord's sake to every human institution. So you submit to your husband because it's the right thing to do, not because it necessarily works. If you look at it simply as something that works, then when it doesn't work for 100 different reasons, it might not work at the time, you'll stop doing it, and it will become a cause for your friendship to fail. Similarly, a husband should love his wife not because she is inherently lovable, not because he feels like loving her necessarily all the time, but because it's right, because he's been commanded to do it. It's the right thing to do, and our motives must be right. We must do it because it's right, or we won't be able to continue meeting each other's needs, and our marriage will falter in terms of its potential for friendship. The second reason is like unto the first. The second reason why you might never be best friends with the person you're married to would be too little attention to the weaknesses that you bring into a marriage. We must attend to our own weaknesses. A man brings in a truckload of self-centeredness, and that self-centeredness keeps him from meeting his wife's need for love. A woman generally brings in, perhaps a daintier quantity, of rebellious independence. And the man's self-centeredness, his most significant weakness, and the woman's rebellious independence, her most significant weakness, are the two diseases that a marriage dies of if a marriage dies. It's a man's self-centeredness that would keep him from feeling like loving his wife in a sacrificial way. It's a woman's rebellion and her independence that would keep her from feeling like submitting to her husband. But we should understand our inherent human weaknesses and say to ourselves, of course I don't feel like doing this. How could a person like me feel like doing something so contrary to my most significant moral weaknesses? And so again, we should attend to the weaknesses and with right motives, because the Lord has called us, men, to put aside our selfishness and women to put aside their independence and get on with the business of meeting one another's needs. I almost feel like stopping here. This is enough to have said, I think, for us to go away with, but I won't stop because I've got more time. The 2 points themselves cover a lot of territory in terms of the likelihood or unlikelihood of you being your spouse's best friends. I think it comes down to just this. The more time and energy you need to devote to compensating for one another's weaknesses, the more time and energy you need to devote to compensating for one another's weaknesses, the less time and energy and interest you will have in being each other's friends. Because the disappointment level will be such, and the amount of work involved in just being compatible will be such, that there's hardly any room or energy, let alone interest, for friendship. You will quickly find yourself saying to yourself, in regard to your spouse, no other friend I imagine being friends with is this much work to get along with. There's no basis for friendship here when it takes us so long just to be at peace. Well, the main reason it's difficult for husbands and wives to be at peace have to do with the needs and the weaknesses. So I give those back to you as a matter of first and second importance, and say that there's hardly any point in hoping to become good friends with each other if we don't keep on with the business of meeting each other's needs by quenching our own weaknesses that are counterproductive to it. But there is more to say, so let me go on and talk more about the prospects of being each other's best friends, in hopes that this is possible and that God will enable you to be each other's friends. The third strike against the whole possibility of friendship is too little use of the glue. Let me tell you what I mean. Too little use of the glue. We are made of two sorts of stuff, we human beings. We are flesh and spirit. And God has given us two sorts of glue. That is, two means to intimacy. Because we are flesh and spirit, there is the prospect God has given us the ability of spiritual and physical intimacy. Spiritual oneness and physical oneness. And if we use large doses, appropriate doses of the means of intimacy, we can get on to the process of being friends. Now, spiritual intimacy is gained through prayer and Bible study, worshiping God together. And physical intimacy is attained through sex. But you've got to understand that it's not sex in itself that creates physical intimacy any more than it's Bible study and prayer in itself that creates spiritual intimacy. You could sit down every night at supper and open your Bible and read it to each other and say a little prayer and get up and be no more spiritually one with each other than when you began. And for that matter, you could go to bed and work very hard on having pleasurable sex every night of your life and not be physically intimate with one another, not be one with one another. It's quite possible to mistake the means of intimacy for the end of intimacy, and that would not be a wise, that would not be a helpful, that would be an unhelpful, that would be a bad mistake to make. Okay? So when you pray together, if you pray together, and when you study the Bible together, if you study the Bible together, and when you talk about the Lord together, understand that the end that you are pointing towards is to get on a spiritual plane with one another, to be spiritually similar to one another. And similarly, when you get around to making love, understand that what you're trying to attain here is a oneness, a sense of intimacy that comes, trust and dependence and closeness and oneness. Our culture is so saturated with the whole idea of sexual pleasure that people approach the sexual act as if the pleasure of sex is the point. And so the whole thing comes down to, was it good for you, was it good for me? But the pleasure of sex is, well, it's not beside the point, but it's not the point in marriage. It's the giving of the pleasure that is the point, and the receiving of the pleasure that's the point, not the experiencing of the pleasure. One person has to experience so that the other person can give it, and so that that person can receive it. And in the giving and receiving of these high levels of pleasure, we develop an intimacy towards one another. We develop a oneness with one another. And it's God's idea that you continue to develop that oneness. For that oneness, that physical bonding, that intimacy is a glue that holds you together. Similarly, your ability to walk with God together, if that is possible, is a form of intimacy which serves as a glue. God has made us flesh and spirit, and He's given us married people two means of maintaining intimacy, two sorts of glue. And if the glue is well used, if we are physically one with one another, intimate on a physical level and intimate on a spiritual level, then we are paving the way to cover a multitude of sins and weaknesses and truly become each other's best friends. But like in the story of the ant and the grasshopper, the intimacy needs to be in place beforehand, before any kind of difficulty occurs. The ant understood that winter was coming, and so stored up reserves of food for the winter. And the grasshopper fooled around all summer long and then starved to death in the winter, right? So similarly in a marriage, if you are not building up a sense of intimacy through the pleasant days of marriage, if you're not understanding the need to be well glued together and working away at it, then when the hard times come, you'll not find any capacity to draw together the way you should. You should already be together in the hard times. And then you can go through those hard times as best friends. So too little use of the glue is a problem on two levels. Then fourthly, and in terms of friendship, this becomes a very critical issue, too few common interests. Too few common interests can be a problem. And if you don't have common interests naturally and are serious about being friends, then you need to shop around and find some. For a true friendship is always about something. The basis of friendship is some common interest in something. I learned this most clearly from C.S. Lewis in his book, The Four Loves. And one of the loves he speaks about is friendship love. And he says that the typical expression of opening friendship would be something like, "What? You too? I thought I was the only one." He says, therefore, we picture lovers face to face, but we picture friends side by side. Their eyes are looking ahead at some item of common interest. This is interesting. He goes on and says, and think about this in the context of a married person wanting to be friends with his or her spouse. He says, we picture lovers face to face, but friends side by side. Their eyes look ahead. That is why those pathetic people who simply want friends can never make any. The very condition of having friends is that we should want something else besides friends. Where the truthful answer to the question, do you see the same truth, would be, I see nothing and I don't care about the truth, I only want a friend, no friendship can arise, though affection, of course, may. There would be nothing for the friendship to be about, and friendship must be about something, even if we're only an enthusiasm for dominoes or white mice. Those who have nothing can share nothing. Those who are going nowhere can have no fellow travelers. If we're going to be friends with one another, our friendship needs to be about something. So we need to find some common interests. Now, the most common interest that married people share is child raising. But I'm not sure that child raising is the potential for friendship. It can be a project that you share as a hobby, that you share as a common interest that makes you friends, but it's quite likely not to be. If there are significant differences in our philosophies of child raising, then child raising is a challenge without much potential for friendship. And I would say if we haven't learned to be friends on other levels, then our child raising efforts will suffer as a result. We need to learn how to work on more neutral and less emotionally charged projects before we can take on the project of child raising with all of its potential for conflict as friends taking on a project. So we need to look elsewhere for issues of common interest in order to develop our friendship. And ministries in the church can serve as that, and projects in the community can serve that way. Physical fitness could serve as a common interest, but probably wouldn't work. And the reason the physical fitness doesn't work as a common interest is because it's so hard for us to motivate one another in a marriage while leaving our sense while meeting each other's needs. I mean, if a woman wants to get her husband involved in physical activity, physical fitness as a hobby, she'll have a hard time suggesting it without sounding like she would respect him a whole lot more if he would only do some exercise. And similarly, if a husband is, some sort of weightlifter or something, wants his wife down in the gym with him, he's going to have a hard time suggesting they do that without making it sound like I would love you a whole lot more if you could press more weight, It sounds like a threat to the basis of love and respect being met, and so it's not likely that physical fitness can be a hobby. Similarly, we need to be careful that our common interests do not threaten one another's sense of being loved or respected. The woman loved, the man respected. So it's important to find common interests that are somehow removed from any question of whether or not our wives respect us, husbands love their wives. So now we go on to the fifth, and it's related to the fourth, because the fourth would be impossible without the fifth. The fifth reason why marriage may not be a friendship is the too little time for each other. Too little time for each other. And many marriages suffer from this to a drastic degree. I have a question that raises another question related to this idea of spending time with each other. The question is, practical question having to do with marriage in real life. How is a married person supposed to stay fascinated by the same person for a lifetime? Marriage is supposed to last for decades and decades. Decades and decades of the one person sitting down after supper with the other person and saying, so, how was your day? Tell me your thoughts. And someone could ask the nasty question, how am I supposed to stay interested in this one person's thoughts for a lifetime. I mean, I don't know that I wouldn't lose interest if I really took the time to find out what was going on consistently in this person's life for a long, long time. How are you supposed to stay fascinated by the same person for a lifetime? The answer is you're not. Because the person you're married to is not supposed to stay the same person for very long. Both people in a marriage should be changing, developing, hopefully developing for the better, becoming wiser, becoming more knowledgeable, becoming kinder, becoming more interesting. All these things should be happening. So that the interest in spending time with each other is in order to keep up with one another and to learn how you are becoming, in what ways your marriage partner is becoming a more fascinating person. So then that question, how are you supposed to stay fascinated for a lifetime, leads to another question about you and your spouse. The question is this: if your spouse is changing for better or for worse, if your spouse is becoming a different person these days, would you be noticing? The only way you'd be noticing is if you're spending time talking and listening. Talking and listening to one another is the way to keep up with the changes that are going on in a person's life. And we hope for change. We hope that we are not staying the same people. God certainly does not intend for us to stay the same people. And we can continue to be fascinated by each other by continuing to keep up with the changes and finding out that we are not the same people that we once were, that we're becoming different and God is changing us. This can be another spiral, hopefully a spiral upward. The less interested you are in your spouse, the less you will listen to your spouse as he or she talks. And the less you listen to your spouse as he or she talks, the less interesting your spouse will be. For we get stimulated to become more fascinating people when people are fascinated with us. When a wife listens to her husband, it seems an awful lot to her husband like she respects him, which drives him, which challenges him, which thrills him to become a more fascinating person. And when a husband really listens to his wife, it occurs to the wife that he must really love her, which stimulates her to become a more interesting person. Quite possibly connected to this point, I leave it under 5, it's not point 6, but quite possibly connected to point 5, too little time for each other, would be another problem in a marriage, which would be too much TV. Because the national average is 24 hours a week. And I've never met anybody who admits to watching 24 hours a week. Most people I've ever talked to about this say, oh, of course, I've watched far less than that. Which means, we're talking averages, that there must be some people who never get away from the television set. The average is 24 hours. Well, let's cut it way down. Cut it way down to a tenth. Let's imagine people only watch 2.4 hours a week. But if that 2.4 hours was spent talking to each other in intense conversation, it would probably be an upgrade for most marriages. If you blocked off 2.5 hours a week, it'd be Thursday nights from 8 to 10:30, to go someplace where you're refreshed and relaxed and just talk to each other, for most people, for most marriages, that would be more time for each other than we are currently finding. So whether it's TV that's competing or something else, you've got to cut out time for each other, to stay in tune with each other, to stay fascinated with each other. A friendship cannot be made out of a marriage any other way. And then as a sixth point, let me say that another strike against the idea of marriage being a friendship is too high a view of marriage. This is a review from before. Too high a view of marriage. If your view of marriage is too high, then your expectations will be too high, and this can ruin your potential friendship because you'll be so disappointed with one another. Now, many people married for a little while are not under any kind of threat to have too high a view of their own marriage. But it can be possible that your marriage suffers from too high a view of marriage in theory. You don't have a very high opinion of your own marriage, but you could continue to maintain a very high view of marriage in theory, which would ruin your ability to live in the real world and to relate to your spouse as an actual human being. And some very fascinating books and very well worth reading books can be part of the problem. I think, for example, of a book that thrills me every time I read it, A Severe Mercy by Sheldon von Auken. This is a fascinating story of a man who met a woman, who fell in love with a woman, and who planned the best marriage possible, who planned an intimacy beyond any intimacy ever experienced by anybody before. It's fascinating reading, but it could really throw a wrench into a marriage if you read this and develop from this a view of marriage thinking that this is the sort of marriage that I should have. Then you'll be disappointed, and your disappointment comes from too high a view of marriage. Listen to this. This is how they got started. He says, they hardly knew each other at this point. We talked deeply, not about the already settled matter of secrets, but about justice between lovers and about how to make love endure. What emerged from our talk was nothing less, we believed, than the central secret of enduring love, which was sharing. Look, we said, what is it that draws two people into closeness and love? Of course, there's the mystery of physical attraction, but beyond that, it's the things they share. We both love strawberries and ships and poems and beauty. All those things bind us together. Those sharings just happen to be, but what we must do now is share everything. Everything. if one of us likes anything, there must be something to like in it, and the other must find it. Every single thing that either of us likes. That way we shall create 1,000 strands, great and small, that will link us together. Then we shall be so close that it would be impossible, unthinkable for either of us to suppose that we could ever recreate such closeness with anyone else. And our trust in each other will not only be based on love and loyalty, but on the fact of 1,000 sharings, 1,000 strands twisted into something unbreakable. Our enthusiasm grew as we talked. Total sharing, we felt, was the ultimate secret of a love that would last forever. And of course, we could learn to like anything if we wanted to. Through sharing, we would not only make a bond of incredible friendship, but through sharing, we would keep the magic of in-loveness. And with every year, more and more depth. We would become as close as two human beings could become, closer perhaps than any two people had ever been. Whatever storms might come, whatever changes the years might bring, there would be the bedrock closeness of all our sharing. So we saw our way, horizon beyond horizon ahead. And so it was to be. Well, this young couple, relating to one another in the 30s and 40s of this century, this young couple were both imaginative, romantic, literary, clever people. And in all likelihood, more imaginative, more romantic, more literary, more clever than any of us. So it's not very likely that any of us could create what they created as is described in this book. If we were to read this book and see it as the story of two unique people who strove together for some unique state of oneness, that would be fine, and it is fine, and the book is fascinating. But if a person a little discontent with his or her own marriage were to read it and see this as how marriage should be in every case, then there's no doubt about it. The disappointment of comparing this to real life is going to be a problem to a marriage. And the problem is that problem we talked about in the first place, too high a view of marriage. So we must be biblical in our view of marriage, neither holding it in too low esteem or too high esteem if we're going to be realistic enough with each other to shrug off 100 little disappointments and be friends anyway. I come to the 7th point, and it's by no means the least important. I think the overriding reason why you would not be your spouse's best friend and your spouse would not be your best friend would be too weak a friendship with God. One of you needs to be a very good friend of God if your marriage is going to become a friendship, I think. Now I go back to the story of A Severe Mercy. A Severe Mercy is a story about idolatry. It's not really a story about marriage at all. It's a story about idol worship. The idol that these people worshipped was one another and their marriage to one another. But God has forbidden idolatry. The first commandment is, you shall have no other gods before me. And this man, Sheldon Von Auken, and the woman whose name was Jean Davis, and they called her Davy, very deliberately tried to have some other god before God. They very deliberately tried to make a god. They referred to their marriage as their idol, and they worshipped it. And of course, their very best efforts failed, because God will, in the final analysis, not allow anyone to have any other gods before them. All attempts to make a god of marriage, to make your marriage what you're living for, will be thrown down by the one true God after all. And if nothing else will end the idolatry of marriage, the death of one of the married people certainly will. Now, in this book, A Severe Mercy, the wife eventually came to see that she loved her husband far more than she loved God, and she stopped loving her husband that much. It was a great blow to the husband. The husband stopped loving his wife supremely when she grew ill and died. It's a very touching thing, and you can read this book and be haunted by it as I have been. But the real haunting thing is that in losing his wife, he lost more than a friend, more than a companion, more than a wife. He lost his God. He lost his idol, and had to learn to turn to the real God after the fact. The Lord Jesus has said that if we abide in His Word, then we are truly disciples of Him, and we shall know the truth, and the truth shall set us free. And some of the slaveries that the Lord intends to set us free from are the slaveries to sin and all of its dangers, including idolatry and all of its dangers. It's God's intention to set us free from all our idols. So if we place too high a view, if we have too high a view of marriage, if we succeed in becoming one another's best friends through our own efforts, it cannot last. God has to be, overall, our best friend. And our friendship with God is necessary to survive not only the daily irritations of a real-life marriage, but the ultimate end of a real marriage. For in all likelihood, one of you is going to be left without the other, eventually. And our friendship with God is what will see us through. As our friendship with God is what will supply us with the grace and the patience to bear with one another, and to forgive one another, and to love one another throughout all the difficulties and challenges of life. One of you is very likely to be left alone in time. And you'll need to lean on some other friend to steady you in that dark time. And God himself is the only one really able to steady you in the hard times. I referred this morning to a man named Henry Venn who was going through a hard time. And the hard time he went through was the loss of his wife. And he lost his wife. She died just as 2 of his 5 children were getting old enough to really value her. And he wrote to the Countess of Huntingdon in the 18th century. The Countess of Huntingdon was an aristocratic lady of great influence for the gospel. She used her riches for the Lord and had many friends in wealthy circles and in the rest of the world who looked to her as an example and learned from her godliness. And this man, Henry Venn, wrote about the loss of his wife and the friendship with God that steadied him, not only through the marriage but at the end of the marriage. And this is what he says: "I am now a living witness of the truth you so strenuously maintain, and of the necessity of that truth in our miserable condition here below. Did I not know the Lord to be mine, were I not certain his heart feels even more love for me than I am able to conceive, were not this evident to me, not by deduction and argument, but by consciousness, by his own light shining in my soul as the sun's doth upon my bodily eyes, into what a deplorable situation should I have been now cast. I've lost all that I could wish myself to have been in the partner of my cares and joys. I've lost her when her industry and ingenuity and tender love and care of her children were all just beginning to be perceived by the 2 eldest girls, and to strike them with a sense of the excellency of such qualities. I've lost her when her soul was as a watered garden, when her mouth was open to speak for God, and he was blessing the testimony she bore to a free, full, and everlasting pardon in the Lord, in the blood of Jesus. Nevertheless, I can say, all is well. Hallelujah. For the Lord God omnipotent reigneth at all times, and in everything pertaining to me, let him do what seemeth him good." Well, again, as with this morning's readings, the godliness of that stirs us up to realize that there's just much more of God than we know if we are considering our relationship to God to be a sort of ordinary, daily bread and butter thing. There is a strength to be found in a friendship with God which will help us through all the irregularities of life, which will help us be potentially much better friends to our spouses than we have been, sharing with them the grace and the glory that we are finding in our friendship with God. And then at the end of our marriage, whether it's a marriage that we regret having come to an end, or a marriage that we look back on with regret, God will be there. Our one eternal friend will be there to see us through the difficulties. And God will day by day be with us to strengthen us to rise to all the challenges that marriage presents. So I'll say in closing that if you are rightly connected to God, if you are developing a strong and real friendship with God, then he will free you to be a good spouse to your marriage partner. And then if you have the proper regard to his or her needs and keep proper attention to your own weaknesses, and if you cultivate intimacy and develop common interests and make time for each other, then it very well may be, in truth, that by the mercy of God and with his full blessing, you will find over the years to come that the person you are peacefully and happily and productively married to is, in fact, your very best friend on earth. That would be the best way to do marriage. It's a goal well worth striving for, and God will help us in it if we are his friend and we are developing our friendship with him all the while. Okay, so that's a biblical view of marriage from one perspective, and we have a little bit of time because I finished just a tiny bit earlier than I usually do for questions and discussion, and perhaps that would be helpful. So it's your turn. Kathy? Yeah. Sure. Yeah. What I tried to illustrate. Thanks for bringing this back. What I tried to illustrate is that finding a common interest or having a common interest doesn't necessarily fill the bill. If a couple was quarreling or at least disagreeing over child raising, then although it's a common interest, it wouldn't help, though it could. And physical fitness just seems to be something that couples come up with. It's something we could do together. And I just wanted to mention that because it's loaded down with implications about our dissatisfaction with ourselves and one another. I mean, that's what physical fitness is about, right? Dissatisfied with our own state, we're going to get on and do something more with what we've got or don't have. But there's dangerous implications across marriage on that one. But I agree. Any friendship could be potentially dangerous to delve, or any common interest could be a help and could not be helped. That's the sort of thing I was trying to say. Yeah, I mentioned those two that I think are particularly dangerous to married couple. A child raising, because it is so emotionally loaded down. It's so important to us. Our children are so close to us that it can hardly be considered a common interest like you would think of stamp collecting or tree climbing or something. It's in a separate category, and it's because it's shared by the marriage. It's critical to the marriage and therefore potentially explosive. And the physical fitness thing, because it has to do with our view of ourselves and view of one another. Right. Yes. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Right. This is meant to fit all sizes. So if there's no sense of friendship in a marriage, then yeah, you should start with something neutral. We both like bingo. Why don't we? Chuck.
Is it true that if this is in a special category of child rearing, then you could actually end up agreeing to go to a certain way if it isn't biblical, blessing in the marriage?
Yeah, blessing is sort of an ambiguous term. You could say it could serve as a friend. You could be fairly, I suppose you could be fairly wrong about your child raising, but it draws you together because you both agree, and so you've got a common interest, and it's not productive in that you're not raising your children right, but it would still serve that purpose of a marriage. I mean, that purpose of friendship for a while anyway. Well, yeah, not very well. No, and the purpose of child raising is not to develop friendship, right? The purpose of child raising is to raise children. So first things first, we gotta grow us some godly adults. That's the assignment. If it serves another purpose of developing friendship, all the better. But that's not what it's for, right? Sir.
Well, I was just going to say, you might have too much togetherness and not be a danger to a marriage. Like to suffocate it.
Too much time with each other?
Yeah, like just.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. For one reason, you could become more and more boring because you're spending your time with one person who may not be getting more interesting. So then, yeah, sure.
Well, there's I was going to say, like, absence makes the miracle. I don't mean that to that degree necessarily, but.
It could. Yeah, it could. That's not universal truth. Sometimes absence makes the heart forgetful. So who knows how it works? Yeah. Brent.
The biggest danger is to get involved with highly competitive things
with each other?
Yeah, because I notice the people I compete with are often people I feel the most camaraderie with.
Yeah.
And if I can lose well to my friend.
Yeah. Well, this would be a matter of knowing yourself. The question, should you have highly competitive interests? That could bond people together, and it could cause a lot of trouble. And you got to be careful. I mean, before you are ever your spouse's friend, you're your spouse's spouse, and there are some considerations that make this friendship unlikely, and some other considerations that make this marriage, if it's a friendship at all, a unique friendship. I mean, it will be work. There's all the work of needs and weaknesses, and that's got to be taken care of. So whether or not playing rugger together or something else highly competitive helps, it would depend a lot on who you are and how you play rugger. Kathy. Mm-hmm.
But the quote itself talks about when each of you have different interests, together trying to find something that interests that is of interest because the other person likes it. Is this quote wrong as well?
No, it's a fine idea, just driven to too great an extreme. Yeah, they determine we will like everything that the other person likes.
I just know of a number. I mean, out there, like there were things that were gifted and are completely different. I know a number of couples like that, or just have different careers, or one has a career and the other doesn't. And the thing that they spend a large portion of their life at is they're different.
Sure.
So
sure.
how do you then become one when what you spend most of your time at is so different?
Well, yeah, I don't object to his idea that we're going to learn to like the things that the other person likes. That's a necessity. But it's the degree to which he was driving it that I objected to. That we will learn, I will learn to like everything you like. There's something to like about it, or you wouldn't like it. And he's saying, we are meant to be one with each other, so we will become absolute one on every level. Well, it's going to create disappointment. It did in their marriage. I mean, they didn't keep the vows that they meant to each other. They didn't keep to the level of faithfulness they meant to. And it would have been better if they'd had a more moderate view in the first place.
So should that,
I don't mean to be confusing. Yeah, it should be a goal, but the infinite degree should not be a goal. Should learn to have things in common, that's what I was saying, but not driving towards some infinite sharing.
I'm not talking about doing things together necessarily, but understanding what the other person
Yeah.
is doing that you can't do together. Either because you just are not both.
Well, yeah, see, that's right. That's a more moderate view. To understand what the person likes that you can't share is one thing. To like it equally is impossible and shouldn't be strived for, striven for. Amanda.
We took your pre-marriage counseling once.
Still together, right?
We are.
I love it when that happens.
The first told me what you wanted us to write down 20 expectations we had of marriage. And I think that's important to recognize too, that some married couples may not want to be best friends.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that might not be their goal
Yeah.
in their marriage. So
Yeah.
as long as you know what your expectations are, then I think it's easier for the other person to meet them.
Mm-hmm. Very right. That's